John McMullen gives us football at 4 every day, 4 o'clock. We talk NFL right here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. And we'll take a look at that. What was Howie Roseman's message with this year's draft class? Just 5 players for the second year in a row. And, you know, it's funny. I know we had Sal Powell on Friday's show, and we tweeted out something that Sal said, and these people went – it was like the most reacted to tweet I think I've ever had. And all he was essentially saying was you only had 5 picks this year, and you had 5 picks last year. And, you know, it was like a situation where you can't waste these picks. You only get 5 of them. All these guys have to have some sort of role. If you're only adding 10 new players to the roster, you know, you got to hope that each guy has a role on this team. And we'll see if these 5 guys this year have a role on this team as we bring in John McMullen to talk a little football at 4. And, John, I'll start with that. What was the message from Howie Roseman with this 5-player draft class?
I don't know if there was a message with the number. I think it was more of a message that a player slipped that they did not believe would.
Who's that,
the Eagles
Sanders?
made a move up. No, Andre Dillard.
Oh, okay.
That's a guy who they did not expect to be there. And they gave up 2 picks to go up and get him. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. A lot of people had him rated top 10, most people in the top 15. So when that starts to slip a little and you can get a player of that caliber and you have to start planning for the future after Jason Peters, I don't have an issue with that. But, yeah, if you take a step back and you look at and I tweeted this out earlier, back-to-back years of only 5 draft picks, that's the low water mark of the entire century in back-to-back years. You're coming up on Carson Wentz's extension, whether it gets done before May 3rd or it's next year. Either way, that's got to stop. I think it will stop next year. I think the Eagles know it has to stop because the volume has to be increased. But they're trying to serve 2 masters in the fact that they understand that hit is coming, but they also believe the window is open, and this is a team that's trying to serve the master of winning the Super Bowl and also building for the future as well, and that's always difficult.
Yeah, and you get 5 guys. 4 of the 5 were on the offensive side of the ball. They finally went with a guy in the 4th round, I guess, that was on the defensive side of the ball. But let's start with Miles Sanders, the running back there. And was he a guy that they thought would be in that spot, number 1? And number 2, what kind of role do we envision for Sanders? Does he come right in and say, hey, you know, they've had some running backs come through the draft. They haven't been able to get on the field, or they've been undrafted guys, Corey Clement, Josh Adams. The guy they did draft, Pumphrey, I don't know that he's ever had a snap.
No, he was a disappointment. He'll be back again, but probably not relevant as far as trying to make this roster. This is the first back they've had in a lot of years. I think after last year they finally swallowed their medicine and said, look, we can't just keep cobbling this together the way we have been. They're trying to get a 3-down back. They tried to do it in the past, and I mentioned Christian McCaffrey. It's easier said than done. They think Miles has the potential to be that. They did not think he would be there at 53 overall. So I think that's what they're most excited about, the fact that the first 2 picks they got were much higher up on their particular board. And obviously that's great value. If Miles Sanders comes in and proves he can be a 3-down back, hey, he'll play. Jordan Howard is here, and he's somewhat proven in Chicago as a 2-down back, and it's nice to have. But if Miles Sanders is the player they think he is, he could turn into the lead back sooner rather than later. So it's always good to have competition. I wouldn't count on it. Usually there's a ramp-up period for rookies. But I think those first 3 guys, and you put in J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, they're all expected to be starters by 2020. That's what the Eagles are planning for.
Yeah, and running back's a spot where you do see rookies come into the league many times and have an impact, especially the very, very good ones. And Miles Sanders is interesting because people would say, well, he only played 1 year. Well, that's because Saquon Barkley was ahead of him. If he was in another situation, he might have been the lead back at Penn State for 2 years or 2 or 3 years and possibly been a first-round pick himself. A lot of people thought he had that much talent.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, that's a good reason to be on the bench behind Saquon Barkley. And this Miles himself was a 5-star recruit. So there was a little bit of a surprise, I think, from people that he didn't transfer. But you can look at that as positive, and the fact that he fought and he tried to compete and he stayed. So there's a lot of things that the Eagles like about him. And as the whole at the top of the draft, and both Joe Douglas and Howie Roseman said it's a character class, and that's what the Eagles are going for.
Yeah.
And you can see, you just have to look at this offseason, whether it's in Pittsburgh, where there's some personality issues with really talented players and they had to move on, or even worse in Kansas City and the off-the-field stuff, dynamic players you're going to have to move on from. So the Eagles place a high value on character, and they love the character of Miles Sanders.
Yeah, John, and I think Howie Roseman said the other day that they've been looking for a running back like Miles Sanders for a few years. So he maybe let the cat out of the bag a little bit, but that these guys they've had, there have been nice stories. Corey Clement, local guy, Super Bowl, makes big play. Josh Adams had a nice, couple games last year, but none of them have been the guy that they've been looking for.
No, and even Jay Ajayi before he was injured. I mean, a much higher level back, but it's really been that way since Doug has gotten here. It's been piecemeal. There's been a different lead back each year. Then the injuries start piling up. It always seems, we always talk about Wendell Smallwood. I joked about that with a bunch of the guys and said, we always predict he's not going to be on this team, and he ends up making the team and playing a role because they haven't been able to fix that position. Hopefully they finally got that done.
Yeah. He's a guy, I've seen him compared to like a Devonta Freeman, one of those type of, power, speed, catch the football. They might have got that 3-down back type of guy. I don't know if they'll be in year number 1, but you should be excited about Miles Sanders. What about the receiver that they bring in, J.J. Arcega-Whiteside? I know if you're not a college football fan, you may not know a whole heck of a lot about him. Specifically, he's on the West Coast, so you don't get to see or hear about him too much. And there was a lot of, there was a lot of depth at receiver, maybe not a lot of high-end talent. When they drafted him, there were other guys on the board that I liked better, but it seems like he could be your heir apparent to Alshon Jeffrey.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that's the plan. He is the heir apparent. He's a very similar receiver. That's what he is. He's a big, lengthy guy, tremendous in the red zone with contested catches. You can imagine him with the back shoulder fades. If anything, he's a little bit more athletic. He did run a 4.49, and I think that pushed him up a lot of boards. He didn't run at the combine, but ran in his pro day. And that opened up some NFL's people's eyes that thought he wasn't quite that fast. So that helps. And he's got the basketball background. His mom and dad played overseas professionally. And he sort of uses his body like a basketball player on the field. And another character guy, very smart, going to Stanford, speaks 3 languages, interned for Condoleezza Rice. So there's that character part of it again. That's big for the Eagles. And we'll see how he fits in. I don't expect him to have a huge role this year. I think, if anything, the Eagles might have looked to upgrade the slot position over Nelson Aguilar. If things fell right in the first round, they got Marquise Brown. Once that happened, Arcega-Whiteside's an outside receiver. Not necessarily going to be a huge role for him, But 2020, again, they expect him to be a starter by then.
Yeah. Now, there was a report over well, not really a report, but Adam Schefter, tweeted out that the drafting of Arcega-Whiteside could help Nelson Aguilar out the door. They've been listening to offers, but I mean, do you think that if he didn't get traded on draft day, is there still a possibility that Aguilar could be on the move?
Well, there's still a possibility. I've talked about that myself a lot. I mean, those whispers won't die, and a lot of it is related to the number, the salary number at $9.4 million. And if you think about this Eagles team, well, Doug Peterson always talks about his game plans. It starts with Zach Ertz and Alshon Jeffrey. From there, you go to Deshaun Jackson. You have the backs. You got to get involved. Jordan Howard. Miles Sanders is just in. You have Dallas Goedert at tight end. There's only one football. And I don't know where you on that list, but it's certainly not. Maybe you could argue he's the fourth most important player in the passing game. And do you really want to pay that guy $9.4 million? You could probably adjust that quickly. So I think all of us thought if Nelson was going to stay, the Eagles would work out an extension to lower that number. As long as that doesn't happen, and as long as he's on the books for that number, he's a trade possibility. But I don't think J.J. Arcega-Whiteside increases those odds because he doesn't play that position. And you need a slot receiver. And Arcega-Whiteside's not going to be a slot receiver.
John McMullen, 97.3, ESPN.com, all of his draft coverage right now. Let's Sharif Miller, you mentioned it. They finally got a toy for Jim Schwartz. I don't know if he'll be ready to play this year, or is he just another one of these guys who, they just stash and keep going with Brandon Graham and Vinny Curry and Derek Barnett until those guys are out of gas, and then they have a bunch of reinforcements just hanging around the practice squad.
Yeah, well, I don't think he's going to be a practice squad. He's going to make this team, but I do think he's a longer-term prospect. I don't expect him. The Eagles are still deep at that position, even without Chris Long. And they brought him in as a fourth-round pick, a day 3 pick, as a developmental guy. And he's a good athlete. He's naturally good against the run, but he struggles a little bit with the pass rush, and he needs to improve his technique. So Jim Schwartz will get him in here, Philip Daniels, and they'll try to work on that and develop him into a player. The Eagles have a lot of guys, Josh Sweat from last year, Joe Osman, they keep mentioning. I mentioned that on Twitter. You don't even bring that guy up, and a lot of people in that building mention his name. So they really like him as a player. So it's about getting a bunch of young defensive ends and trying to coach them up and get them ready for that second wave. And that's what I was talking about, trying to serve the two masters, compete now, but also build younger players up for the future.
And then in the 5th round, they took a quarterback. Maybe Donovan McNabb was right.
Well, they want to get in that sort of Jeffrey Lurie mentioned it earlier in the offseason about drafting a quarterback once every 2 years and sort of have that constant motion at that position. And if things work out, you see what's happened over the years in New England with people like not only Jimmy Garoppolo, but Jacoby Brissett before him, and even veteran guys like Matt Castle and Brian Hoyer. What you can do if you build up a backup quarterback who's kind of relevant and proves himself, then you can maybe spin him off. And if the worst does happen and you have injuries, well, then you have that second quarterback. So the Eagles want to get into that mode of doing that, and that's what I think the Clayton Thorson pick is about.
Yeah, and obviously Sudfeld, you would think anyway, is the backup this year. Does he have any shot to compete for that role? Because, as we know, the backup quarterback here has been pretty important.
Yeah, no, I think Nate's the guy. I don't think he's been brought in to compete with Nate Sudfeld. I think earlier the Eagles were hopeful bringing in more of a veteran presence that would push Nate a little bit more, but that's just difficult to do. Because I've said this a lot. Veteran guys aren't going to come in unless they're promised a role. They're not going to come in to compete. So the Eagles were always going to have a really, really difficult time finding that. So they went a different route, and they got a developmental guy. And Doug Peterson has been good about developing quarterbacks. One issue I have, he wasn't very accurate. I think that was the biggest knock on him at Northwestern. And if you talk to scouts, that's the one thing it's tough to fix. It's kind of if you're accurate or if you aren't. And he's not been all that accurate at the college level. That usually doesn't change at the pro level.
John, real quick, the Eagles have just exercised the fifth-year option on Carson Wentz for the listeners out there. So it seems that they're happy with him.
Yeah, they're not moving on from Carson Wentz.
No.
May 3rd was the deadline, so it was always going to happen. It's just a matter of did the extension, the big money extension, come before they exercise the option, or if they push it down the road a little bit. Either way, it's coming. And the longer you wait, the more money it's going to be. And I think, Joel Corey, who does a great job, former agent, works with CBS, talks about contracts, mentioned Ben Roethlisberger's extension at $31 million. That's going to be the template. That's the number you're going to talk about, $31 million average annual value. And that's why we talked about the volume of picks, 5. That can't continue. It's got to change next year, but the Eagles know that.
Yeah, and they went out in the undrafted market, as all these teams do. And what I find interesting is it's almost like teams, like in the NBA, there's only 2 rounds, so you'll take drafted stash guys and stick them overseas and guys who are raw. It almost seems like in the NFL, you can take some shots on some skill position players and just load up on linemen in the undrafted market and like linebackers, where those positions that don't have a lot of value anymore, you can kind of load up on, because I see the Eagles went out and got linebackers and a lot of linemen, as in the undrafted market. But do any of these guys, stick out as a, hey, you might be hearing this guy's name this year?
Well, I think you look at need positions, and T.J. Edwards, linebacker, Wisconsin, and linebacker. The Eagles didn't get one. That might be their biggest need on paper. And he's was a draftable commodity, at least according to most people. Usually on all the top 5 lists of undrafted players, it's really kind of a Mike linebacker, a middle linebacker, so he's a 2-down guy. But that's what the Eagles need. They don't need a 3-down linebacker. So I think that's a name, certainly the headliner of their class. And then the second part is they still need a replacement for Stefan Wisniewski as the interior game day backup. And that's a guy who's got to play all 3 positions, whether it's center, right guard, left guard, and be able to go in and game and do each seamlessly. And that's usually not a role for a rookie. The Eagles are bringing in a lot of bodies. That's why they're doing that. You see a lot of offensive guards in undrafted free agency with the ability to play center. But that's usually a role for a veteran guy. So I think that's not a sexy thing to say. And certainly if you're looking at a football team and you're saying the weakness is an interior game day backup, that's pretty good, but still, it's something the Eagles have to address. I do believe that.
Yeah, and you look at this draft, just the 5 players, as we mentioned, and you mentioned the 5 the year before, you would hope that a couple of these guys make an impact, because it seems that we talked about entering the draft, there wasn't a lot of immediate this year spots. But in the next year or so, you're going to start to have to see some of the regular playing time as early as next year. And I know a lot of times people see draft new players, they want them to make an impact right away. The Eagles are in a position they don't need that, but they are going to have to start getting something from these draft classes pretty soon, and they haven't been getting much the last couple of years.
Well, yeah, and they're not going to get much from the number 1 overall pick that they traded up and gave up 2 extra picks for. So if you're going to look at it short term, barring injuries. I mean, Diller's not going to play, but it is very important.
He might get a lot of time, though, if Peters continues down the path he has the last 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Vikai's been out there a lot. He should take over that role as the game day swing tackle. So perhaps, but if things do go to plan, he's not going to play much. And the Eagles understand that, and there's no concern over that. They prefer to get him in under Jeff Stoutland anyway. He played in an air raid offense, so there is work to do from a technique standpoint. And they have room to wait. But things are already starting. Chris Long has told this team to plan like he's not going to be here. So already you need a one of the defensive ends. Now they brought back Vinny Curry, but you're going to need one of those guys that I mentioned, whether it's Josh Sweat or Sharif Miller or Joe Osman, somebody to step up, a younger player, and we'll see how it works out. But the Eagles are happy. I mean, if you look at what Dallas Goedert did for him last year, and even Avonte Maddox, that's pretty good. You mentioned Sal Powell with Jordan Mailata. I thought, that's a creech. I don't know the context of what he said, but the Eagles haven't given up on him. Other people have sort of placed these unrealistic expectations on him.
Right. I think that's who. I think those were the people he was referring to. Like these people who thought this 7th rounder was going to come in and take over for Jason Peters. That's not.
Yeah, that's done. Well, and you got people like Brian Baldinger, and I love Baldy, and he played in this league, saying the guy's going to be an all-pro. The Eagles hope he's a swing tackle in 2 years. That's what they're hoping. That's the goal.
Right.
And they're still online for that.
And really, it was kind of what we were talking about. He prefaced it by saying they only had 5 picks this year and 5 picks last year, so you really can't waste a pick. And maybe they could have got Mailata in free agency and taken a guy who would have, been had more of a role in that because they traded up to get him.
Well,
right?
Some of those 7th round picks are about sort of. Sometimes you like a guy who's undrafted, but you don't think you're going to be able to get him.
Yeah.
So you'll just take a flyer. There's a lot. I mean, Mike Mack, people were joking, was taking a guy, was trying to stump the truck, so to speak, on the NFL Network as a general manager with a 7th round pick, and he was able to do it. Once you get down that low, I don't have a problem taking a flyer on some guy who's really raw and you can project because it's so rare that those guys are going to hit anyway. And as I said, undrafted free agency is a crapshoot because if you talk to agents, and I talk to a lot of them, they'd rather have their guys be undrafted because then you can look at who needs what and sort of pick and choose where to go for your guy to give them the best opportunity. So it really is. We talk, everyone says crapshoot a lot, but once you get down that low, it really is a crapshoot.
All right. And by the way, real quick, 7th round pick for Hassan Ridgeway, defensive tackle, just adding more depth at that position.
Yeah, I like that trade. I mean, that's a perfect example of it. 24-year-old guy, so he's very young. He's already played over 30 games in this league. Hasn't done a whole heck of a lot, but he's proven he can play at this level. And if you get him in under the right coaching, who knows what happens? Probably a better chance for a guy like that than if you sit at that pick and just take a swing at a 7th rounder.
All right, football at 4, John McMullen. All of his draft coverage is at 97.3 ESPN.com. Take a look at all the undrafted guys that they added. And also, Eagles stressing quality over quantity in the 2019 draft. Check it out at 97.3 ESPN.com. All right, John, we will chat football tomorrow.
All right, thanks, Mike.